this in terms of interrogating the participant. We're not interrogators, and this is not our function, right, as qualitative methods research. So there's a fine line between conducting qualitative research and conducting an interrogation, one that can easily be crossed by an ill-trained or novice researcher. And I think I just made that pretty clear, right? So, recap this first bit. Two things that surface as major importance, right? And you can see this is extremely conceptual, right? This is not your sort of traditional 101 qualitative methods research, right? It's important, no matter what research model you're using, ethnography, case-based, phenomenological, participatory action, narrative, what have you, that the researcher recognizes that we, as researchers, have indirect access to the life story of the participant, right? Participant has direct access, right? We have to make sure, insofar as our participant, in some nuanced sense, is labeled as perpetrator at large, you know, socioculturally labeled as perpetrator, the actions that he or she participated in, we don't bias our interpretation of their life story, because if we bias it, that is going to surface in our findings. If it's impossible and we're just biased, we can't overcome our bias, then we need to bracket our bias in our research so that when we present our findings, the reader recognizes that, hey, this interpretation might be a bit biased, but at least the author was honest, saying I'm biased in the interpretation of participant X's life story, right? Very, 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 very important. And obviously this is an ethical consideration because we don't want to be in the position of casting judgment or demonizing the participant's action. More importantly, what we're interested in is not the action itself, but the conditions that led the particular participant to participate in action X. It's this information that we generalize, right? Because then we can say, well, human beings are roughly similar in the way in which they respond. Not all the way, because I don't believe in human nature, but human beings, personally, human beings are roughly similar in the way in which they respond to a set of stressors, roughly. And here are the conditions, here are the stressors that led participant X to perform these actions. It is important to recognize that other individuals that have a same response to these stressors, or could have a same response to these stressors, or who could have a same response to these external environmental stimuli, could potentially find themselves doing exactly the same thing. I would never be the type of person that did X. Well, that's because the external stimuli hasn't presented itself to you in order to motivate you to do action X. My research is saying that based on my interviews with X number of participants, here are the generalized findings that I found. We don't really care about the participant's narrative, and I don't mean care in the sense of emotional attachment. We're doing objective research, so what's motivating the research are the conditions, right? And here are the findings, and my conclusion is going to be something along the lines of, given conditions X, Y, Z, participants with sort of inclination X, Y, Z will probably commit actions X, Y, Z, right? That's what's important. So what we're really looking for are these, oops, my marker's out of ink. What we're really looking for are these conditions. Okay, so that ends that bit. Let's go on to ethics and qualitative research. Alright, so the next bit is ethics in qualitative research and coping with conflict. So let's look at FLICT. Okay. So the idea, I am by profession a conflict resolutionist, right? And the interesting bit on conflict resolution, as I can't really say an emerging discipline because it's been around for 20 plus years, but relatively speaking, with respect to anthropology and sociology and philosophy that's been around for 2,000 years, it's a fledgling, brand new discipline. So a lot of this is going to be in flux, right? And a lot of this is still needing profound theoretical sort of underpinning. There really isn't a very strong theoretical basis to a lot of conflict resolution. A lot of it borrows from sort of legalistic jargon and conceptions. So for those of you, I'm not going to do it, but for those of you who are interested in conflict resolution, the discipline is in dire need of sort of theoretical framework. There needs to be a theoretical framework for conflict resolution. This bit I'm just prefacing by telling you that a lot of it isn't there. So I'm going to, it's difficult, but I'm going to have to do sort of this, not on the fly because I've prepared, but there isn't a lot of resources that I could pull from because they just don't exist. Okay, so first thing, right, coping with conflict. Number one, dealing with conflict. Dealing with conflict. Here's a quote, and I want to discuss the quote and then talk about what this might mean, right? Ethics is about how we deal with conflict. It's a great line, right? Ethics is about how we deal with conflict. Disagreement and ambivalence rather than attempting to eliminate it, right? Ethics is about how we deal with conflict. Disagreement and ambivalence and how we attempt to eliminate it. So the idea is we as moral agents, as researcher or participant, it doesn't really matter, are going to have a stressor. Right? We're going to have conflict. F-L-I-C. We're going to have conflict. And this conflict is going to impact us in some sense, right? Someone is very aggressive, right? You can imagine that you get an email all caps, all red. Oh my goodness, there's a stressor. You see a brute on the street and he starts to approach you rapidly. There's a stressor. Your boss comes over to your desk, you're sitting, he's standing, and he starts to wave his finger in your face. Stressor. You come home and the kids, blah, 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 but you have an idea, right? So we as human beings are going to be inevitably confronted with stress, right? I could change the mode and the tone of this lecture immediately and introduce a bit of stress. It would be diabolical for me to do that. I wouldn't do it, but I could, even though I'll never see you, I don't even know who you are that's watching this video right now, and thanks for watching the video, I could introduce stress, and despite the fact that I don't present a physical threat to you, I couldn't. I don't even know where it's, I mean, YouTube and the internet is almost entirely anonymous, for the most part. I could introduce stress in your life. Like, I could, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, this is sort of the stuff that I do on the side, but I could introduce a stress into your life, right, and change physiologically our relationship. This is sort of, and this is what I'm saying, there's very little research on this stuff in conflict resolution. There is a sense in which, according to the author, that ethics is the way in which we learn to cope with that. In introducing this stress, it's going to create and force me to do an action, right? Now, if this is the participant and we're the researcher here, what we want to do is we want to identify the stress. What was it that led you to do action X, right? This is a participant, we're the researcher, right? We want to identify the stressors, right? Because the stressors are generalized, right? That's the point of qualitative research, right? We want to be able to generalize our findings across the spectrum of human beings, as many human beings as we can potentially get this information to apply to. That's what we want, right? So, what were the general stressors? Will those stressors appear in other people's lives? Yeah, sure. Okay, what are those? Okay, how did the participant react to those stressors? That's a little bit more psychological, but how did the participant react to those stressors? But we want to know what the action was. But all of this is direct. All of this is direct. What we have to recognize as qualitative methods researchers, and this is what's important, and I love the term, this is why I selected the quote, right? Disagreement and ambivalence rather than attempting to eliminate it. There is a sense in which there is a relationship, a completely invisible relationship between this particular participant and those stressors in the external world. And what we want to gain access to is how cognitively, right? This is where your research gets really good if you can pull it off. It's not an easy thing to do. It's an even harder thing to explain. How cognitively is the participant relating him or herself? What's the relationship, the cognitive relationship